Yo, Kenya! Remember that electric moment back in 2022? The air was thick with anticipation and hope. William Ruto, the self-proclaimed hustler-in-chief, swept to power in a wave of enthusiasm. He promised a new dawn, a break from the old guard, a chance for the common man to rise and shine. It was a message that resonated deeply, especially with young people tired of the same old political dynasties and their empty promises. Ruto tapped into a deep well of frustration and disillusionment. He spoke of his humble beginnings, selling chickens on the side of the road, a story that many could relate to. He promised to uplift the hustlers, the everyday Kenyans grinding to make ends meet, those who felt left behind. It was a powerful narrative, one that contrasted sharply with his opponent, Raila Odinga, a scion of the political elite, who seemed out of touch with the common man's struggles. But hope can be a fragile thing, easily shattered by the harsh realities of life. Fast forward to 2024, and that initial optimism has faded, replaced by a sense of disillusionment. The reality of governing a complex nation like Kenya has collided head-on with Ruto's populist promises, revealing the challenges of leadership. The economy is struggling, the cost of living is skyrocketing, and those very hustlers who propelled Ruto to power are feeling the squeeze more than ever. Turns out, running a country on catchy slogans and grand promises is a lot harder than it looks. And you know what happens when promises are broken and people feel lied to? Discontent brews and tensions rise. That's right, my friends. Things get messy, very messy indeed. And in Kenya, messy often means taking to the streets, with protests and political unrest becoming the norm. Now, to understand the anger boiling over in Kenya, you got to understand the hustler movement. This wasn't just some catchy campaign slogan. It was a whole vibe, a way of life, a rallying cry for the disenfranchised. Ruto tapped into a deep-seated resentment towards the political elite, the same families who've been calling the shots since independence, perpetuating a cycle of inequality. See, Kenya has always been a tale of two nations, a stark contrast between the haves and the have-nots. On one hand, you have the privileged few, living it up in their ivory towers, disconnected from the struggles of everyday Kenyans, enjoying the fruits of a system designed in their favor. Then you have the hustlers, the vast majority struggling to make ends meet, facing a system seemingly rigged against them, where opportunities are scarce and survival is a daily battle. Ruto, with his talk of lifting up the hustlers, promised to bridge that divide, to create a more inclusive society. He vowed to champion the small business owner, the mama mboga selling vegetables by the roadside, the boda boda driver navigating the chaotic streets, the unsung heroes of the economy. He promised a more equitable Kenya, where hard work, not connections, would determine your success, where everyone would have a fair shot at prosperity. But the reality is, Kenya's problems run deep, rooted in decades of systemic issues. Decades of corruption, economic mismanagement, and a widening inequality gap can't be fixed with a snap of the fingers, even with the best of intentions and the most passionate promises. And when those promised changes didn't materialize, the frustration, the anger, it didn't just disappear, it festered, growing more intense with each passing day. Now, let's talk economics, shall we? Because when the wallet is empty, the stomach is grumbling, and the bills are piling up, that's when people really start to pay attention. And in Kenya, the economic situation has been tougher than a 2-shilling steak. See, Ruto inherited an economy already reeling from the global pandemic, rising inflation, and a crippling drought. But instead of easing the burden on ordinary Kenyans, his government doubled down on taxes. We're talking about new levies on everything from fuel to mobile money transactions. Things that hit the poor and the middle class the hardest. Adding insult to injury, corruption scandals continued to rock the government. Remember all those promises of transparency and accountability? Yeah, about that. It's like the only thing trickling down in Kenya is more corruption. So, you've got a perfect storm brewing. A cost of living crisis, a government perceived as out of touch and corrupt, and a young, tech-savvy population increasingly aware of the inequalities around them. It was only a matter of time before that pot boiled over. And boil over it did. In June 2024, Kenya's youth said, "Enough is enough." They took to the streets, and let me tell you, it wasn't pretty. We're talking massive protests, tear gas, running battles with the police, the whole shebang. The immediate trigger? Those new taxes, of course. But it was about more than just money. It was about a deep-seated anger at a system that seemed rigged against them, a political class more interested in lining their pockets than serving the people. The protests, which started in Nairobi, quickly spread to other parts of the country. From Kisumu to Mombasa, young people were making their voices heard. They stormed Parliament, demanding action from their elected representatives. And for a brief moment, it felt like the country was on the verge of something truly revolutionary. But as we've seen time and time again, when people rise up, those in power rarely respond with understanding or compassion. Instead, they often resort to the oldest trick in the authoritarian playbook, brute force. Now, the Kenyan government's response to the protests was about as subtle as a rhino in a china shop. Think tear gas, water cannons, and good old-fashioned police brutality. Yep, they really went full Wakanda forever on their own people. Videos of police officers beating up protesters, even those just peacefully demonstrating, went viral. Journalists covering the protests were harassed, detained, and some even assaulted. It was a blatant attempt to stifle dissent, to silence the voices of those demanding change. And then, things got even shadier. There were credible reports of the government using agent provocateurs, folks disguised as protesters, to incite violence and looting. It's a classic tactic: create chaos, then use that chaos to justify cracking down even harder. The government's heavy-handed response only added fuel to the fire. It confirmed what many young Kenyans already suspected, that their leaders were more interested in protecting their own power than listening to the concerns of the people. Now, let's be clear. The protests in Kenya aren't just about taxes or even police brutality. Those are just the symptoms of a much deeper disease plaguing Kenyan politics. We're talking about the systemic rot of corruption, the erosion of public trust, and the widening gap between the haves and the have-nots. For decades, Kenyan politics has been dominated by a small, elite group more interested in self-enrichment than public service. They've treated the country's coffers like their own personal bank accounts, siphoning off funds meant for development, education, and healthcare. And the saddest part? This corruption has become so normalized, so ingrained in the system, that many Kenyans have simply lost faith in their government. They've become cynical, resigned to the fact that things will never really change. But the protests, even as they were met with violence, offered a glimmer of hope. They showed that beneath the surface of apathy, there's a deep well of anger, a yearning for a more just and equitable society. Here's the thing about this new generation of Kenyan activists. They're different. They're not bound by the old tribal allegiances that have long been exploited by politicians to divide and conquer. They're tech-savvy, interconnected, and acutely aware of the injustices around them. This is a generation that grew up with the internet, with access to information and ideas from around the world. They've seen what's possible, and they're not afraid to demand better for themselves and their country. And unlike previous protest movements in Kenya, this one is largely leaderless. It's a decentralized, organic movement fueled by social media, with young people organizing themselves online and taking to the streets to make their voices heard. This lack of a central figure makes it harder for the government to crack down, to co-opt or silence the movement. It's a sign that Kenyan democracy, despite its flaws, is evolving, that a new generation is finding its voice and demanding to be heard. Look, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. The road ahead for Kenya is long and uncertain. The deep-seated problems of corruption, inequality, and political impunity won't be solved overnight. But the protests, as messy and chaotic as they were, have shaken things up. They've forced a national conversation about the kind of society Kenya wants to be. The challenge now is to translate that anger, that energy, into meaningful change. It's about holding leaders accountable, demanding transparency, and creating a system that works for all Kenyans, not just the privileged few. And that's where you come in, my friends. Whether you're in Kenya or watching from afar, we all have a role to play in supporting the struggle for a more just and equitable world. Amplify the voices of those demanding change. Support organizations working to promote democracy and human rights. And never, ever underestimate the power of people united for a common cause. The future of Kenya belongs to its young people. It's up to them to channel their anger into action, to build a future worthy of their dreams. And who knows, maybe, just maybe, they'll succeed in creating a Kenya that lives up to its promise, a beacon of hope, not just for Africa, but for the entire world. A luta continua. The journey is arduous, but every step forward is a victory. Grassroots movements are the backbone of this transformation. Women and youth are at the forefront, leading the charge for equality. Artists and cultural leaders are using their platforms to inspire change. The Kenyan diaspora is also playing a crucial role, lending their voices and resources. Together, we can turn the tide and create a Kenya that truly reflects the dreams of its people. For the sake of future generations, the fight must continue. The spirit of unity and resilience will guide Kenya towards a brighter, more equitable future.